Yeah, our daily lives depend on it. On many services, like I don't know, listening to music via Spotify, ordering an Uber via the app, changing investments in your portfolio, software, right? Lots of software. Usually defined by the business that have all these crazy ideas, and ideally software should be developed rather faster than slower, because they have lots and lots of ideas, maybe smaller budget or limited amounts of budget. And potentially we could create a problem that's called technical debt. And technical debt even could cause technical bankruptcy or even bankruptcy of an organization. Today we're talking together here. My name is Kees de Koning. Edwin Bleijenberg. Edwin is lead developer on a huge project we run and maintain for BNP. Today I would like to talk about technical debt with you, Edwin, about one of the potential risks or things that happen anyway with development. Can you explain to me what technical debt is? Do you have a few examples? Because it does, I can't really grab it, right?
Yeah, it's easy to get bogged down in definitions, but examples usually work a little better. So let's say you're developing a software platform, or a piece of software, and at first you think, you're making headway, you're working towards your MVP perhaps. You're going nice and quick, you're figuring things out, you're setting things up, but then at some point you hit a mark where you feel that the development is getting a bit more sluggish, and you might not have the same speed as before. And sometimes technical debt may have an influence there. And it's almost inevitable to incur some kind of technical debt when you're developing, but luckily there are also ways to prevent that. But if you look at how it comes to be, there are various ways in which it can arise. One of them can be, we just discussed that you're working on an MVP application. So usually what you see is that you want
what's an MVP application?
A minimum viable product.
Yeah.
So it's you probably have some wild ideas, and you want to set up a whole big platform. But you have to scope it down somewhere to limit your project, especially to limit your time to market usually. So you determine your scope, which is not the full scope yet, because you'll have a backlog which you'll work on after the MVP phase. But during that MVP phase, it's very important that you move quickly. So what you might do at some points is you might make some decisions that are not per se the way you would like to develop your software, but you choose to do so because you want to move fast. That can be something like not choosing to make something configurable, but for instance hard coding it for now and then maybe dealing with that later.
Just for speed, right? You're developing and
exactly.
And instead of creating configuration files where you can maintain that centrally, you're like, I'm just gonna hard code it.
It's possible, yeah. It can be that you choose that to move a bit faster.
Yeah.
Now at least.
Do you have other examples?
Well, I wanted to actually go into this example a bit more to flesh it out, because what can happen is that initially you don't need to change your configuration much, because you have your MVP set up and that's all, like smaller boundaries maybe. It could be that you're going with a multi-tenant setup, but you're just starting with one. But what you might soon realize is that the fact that you did not choose to go for a configurable approach might start working against you, because now you have, for instance, 5 tenants which all need their own configuration, but then you need to make some changes in your code base to accommodate that.
Yeah.
And each deployment might take a bit more time because of that. Because if you have a configurable setup, you can just change your configuration, deploy your application, and you're done. But if you don't have that and you have it hard coded, you need to go back every time into your source code, make some changes, go through your review process, through your scanning tools, etc. And then you get to your deployment phase. So that each time might cost a bit more time. And in choosing not to go for the configurable option and saving some time in development initially, you actually start to lose a bit more time later on. And that in itself is a sign of technical debt, because you have a situation where you kind of took a loan on the flexibility of your application, and now you are faced with the consequences of that, and you kind of have to pay off that debt. So you want to still deal with the configurability because now you have to, and you have that extra time that you were spending on your deployments, for instance.
Yeah.
And that is kind of the cost of technical debt in that sense.
But that's a very detailed description of a good example. Do you have other smaller or examples that are even more tangible to me that you see? Because this is, for example, I'm making something configurable instead of hard-coded. Well, I guess we all understand that if you hard-code something that at first it's going faster, right? You can move on to the next functionality you're going to develop. Do you see other examples as well?
Yeah, I mean, another example is when you have a piece of software.
Yeah.
There are multiple responsibilities within that piece of software, and in order to move fast in your MVP phase, you might choose to just have that all bundled together, and you just want to get it out the door. You're not.
Usually, you think the application is still smaller.
Yeah, exactly. So you're not putting all that much thought in the architecture of your application, for instance.
Yeah.
And what that can lead to is that you find, again, that there is some flexibility issue there, because you want to make some changes, but because things are tied together, it becomes a bit more difficult, and you're going to have to pull it apart a little bit, move things away from each other, and separate out the responsibilities to make sure that you don't have things bleeding over into each other, which makes it more difficult to understand the code, it makes it more difficult to maintain the code, and it also makes it more difficult to make further changes.
Exactly. I started my introduction blaming the business potentially a little bit, like saying, oh, faster, faster, faster. And blaming is not, obviously, probably not the right word. Are there other reasons that technical debt can arise? Because I can imagine that if I pressure as the business, the development team, like, we need to go faster, 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 you might take shortcuts at that point.
You might,
quicker. You might. Are there any other reasons that you see that technical debt can arise?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, business decisions are not the only reason it can arise, indeed. Exactly. Sometimes when you're developing a new piece of software, you might also use new technologies. Yeah. Maybe you don't have as much experience with it yet, you're kind of figuring it out. So as you go, you might have new insights that make you kind of doubt your earlier decisions, for instance. So you set up this new technology, and you configure it a certain way, and it does what it's supposed to do.
Exactly.
But then later on you find that you want to do something additional, but it would have been better if you would have used a different configuration, for instance, or like a different
piece of
part
software,
of the library that you're using, or something like that. And that is kind of renewed insight.
Exactly.
So it's definitely not a business issue, because the business has no part in that, in that sense, because it's really technical. But it's still something that you have to deal with it, because you find yourself realizing that you need to do things a little differently. So then you need to invest time to actually do that.
Yeah, check.
And that is really this thing that might come with new technology.
Yeah, that's a nice example. But this is something that the development team has a lot of insight in, I guess, right? And let's say I'm from the business, and I don't have daily contact with my development team. Maybe I should. What could be good signs for me to see, like, oh, hey, maybe we're building up technical debt? Because I need that slowly over time with the decisions or shortcuts or new insights, as you mentioned, you slowly build more and more debt. Yeah. A little bit of debt is probably not that bad, but how would I see from an outsider that there's actually a technical debt, because in a company I can just ask, hey, what's the P&L, or what's any other statements that show me how much debt there is, right? How could I see that?
Yeah, the tricky part with technical debt is that it's a lot of times it's invisible, at least to the business, and it can be quite important to keep tabs on that with your development team. So it's, in that sense, your development team's job to make technical debt visible. So if you incur technical debt, that happens, it's fine. Exactly. Usually the problems arise when you have the business and you have the technical team. The technical team is busy with their developments, and then suddenly they announce to the business, hey, we now have to deal with this big amount of technical debt, and then the client is surprised, like, but how, and where does it come from?
As a business, like, you never showed me the inside.
And that's a sign that you indeed haven't really been consciously thinking about your technical debt. The best way to be able to deal with technical debt is to make sure that you can see it. So if you make a decision of which you already know that at some point in the future you'll have to deal with the consequences of that.
As a developer.
As a developer, indeed. But you do that for various reasons. And this is mostly about the business decisions, actually. Because if a business decision drives you to incur some technical debt, it's especially important that you make it visible so that you can be in communication with your client, open communication. Like, hey, we do this now. We have this decision that we're making, which has these results. Let's be mindful of that in the future. And in those cases, you don't have this surprise effect when you announce it to your client anymore, because your client already knows. And if you keep adding the technical debt to your backlog,
basically
it's very visible,
right?
Exactly, it's very visible, and you're not faced with these surprises at some point down the line where you weren't aware that something was happening, because it's always visible and you can always point to it. Hey, we did this because of this and this reason. Now we have to deal with it for this reason. And then you have a whole different dynamic than when you have a situation where it's this dynamic where you amass technical debt, but you don't make it visible, and then at some point it becomes inevitable to deal with it, because otherwise you're stuck.
And yeah, exactly, and the stuck. I think that's an interesting point that you mentioned. So what if my development team they made it very visible what the technical debt is and what it's building up over time. Well, I think it's already a problem that it's building up anyway, but we could talk about that as well, maybe. It would be, for me, from the business point of view, I could say, you know what, but I promised to the board or to someone else that we would have delivered this new feature within this year. So technical debt, Edwin, you surprised me that I need to work on it for, I don't know, 2-3 months. Working 2-3 months on technical debt, it's called refactoring, I believe, right? So if you're going to refactor for 2-3 months, does it add any business value, visible business value? Let's put it like that.
Usually it doesn't, indeed. So
exactly.
That's what makes it very hard to sell.
Exactly. And what if I can't sell it to my board, and then let's just continue developing these other features?
Well, I mean, one of the signs that you're dealing with technical debt can also be that if you request new functionality as a client, you can kind of see that the size of the estimates keeps rising steadily. So
estimates of new features, basically.
The
and why
is
it then the rising?
Well, when you have a lot of technical debt in your system and you have to make new changes or additions, you also have to deal with technical debt, because otherwise you might not have the flexibility that you need to actually add your new feature or configurations or whichever the exact subject is. But like the 2 or 3 months of refactoring that you would need for dealing with technical debt, that's exactly a situation in which it has already gone too far.
Exactly.
You don't want to end up there. So
but that's basically
if we track
paying off the technical debt. And what you're saying now with developing new features takes longer time.
Yeah.
Probably because
in a sense, In a sense, that's also the paying off of your technical debt. It's just you don't do it in a big bang, but you kind of do it gradually. And actually, the gradual approach is what you want to be doing.
Yeah, but if you take it one step back, so creating new features, I'm ignoring the development team, like, hey, listen, we need to pay off the technical debt. We keep doing the features. And so I see the amount of time that we are busy with building new features, it increases over time, what you're saying. Because, for example, this configuration file wasn't there, it's just hard-coded.
For instance?
Could you call that, in the sense, we're talking about technical debt, could you say that is sort of the interest rate that you pay every time?
Yeah, you could say that.
On new features?
Yeah, I think every time you have to make changes in a way that you have to kind of circumvent your technical debt because you can't deal with it exactly, you kind of start replicating, for instance, a certain setup instead of taking similar setups and combining them somehow, or introducing a new pattern.
Yeah,
exactly. Something like that deals with your flow of information a bit better, or things like that. And if you keep not doing that, indeed, each time you have
this
to
pressure
replicate
from
things,
the board, right? And we need to keep developing.
You have this, maybe this relatively inflexible part of your system that you have to kind of replicate every time, and then you just create more of the same technical debt that you already had.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And so let's say I keep ignoring the development team, the amount of technical debt is increasing. I can imagine then as well, for example, I see, hey, new features take more time to develop. Let's add additional team members. But I guess technical debt makes that complex as well, adding team members, because if it's such a mess, I can say, mess maybe not, but
I think if you run into a situation where it seems like you have to add more people to still be able to move in the same speed, that also increases the cost.
Yeah, and you're building up probably even more technical debt.
Possibly, yeah. If you don't deal with it, yeah.
And for a new person, it's probably very difficult the learning curve is probably very steep.
It can
because there's so much technical debt that needs to be taken into account.
It can be, yeah. I mean, that all depends on the complexity of your system in general, of course. But yeah, it can be definitely that technical debt has a negative impact on the ease of understanding your code base, or the maintainability and such.
Let's draw an even darker scenario here. So from the business, I still feel that pressure. I have this team, a senior development team that says, Kees, you keep ignoring paying off the technical debt. You keep saying we need to build new features, etc., etc. What happens? What happens at a certain point if I don't know, you say as the lead developer of the team, Kees, I'm sorry, but now it's like 6 or 7 months to pay off the technical debt. And to me, it feels like every time short wins, maybe like saying, okay, we're quickly developing.
Yeah.
But then I have a major problem, because then I need to go to my board saying, I'm sorry, but we're going to have a development stop or feature stop.
For instance, but it can also be a bit more subtle in the sense that what we discussed earlier already is that you see your estimates for new features slowly rising. That coming,
keep interest rate paying more and more.
More and more time is necessary to develop new features.
Yeah.
At some point, the business might find that the cost of a new feature is no longer worth it.
Exactly.
Because it costs so much that the revenue you're going to get from the feature it's not like in balance. It's out of whack.
And what needs to be done? What is the 1 or 2 things that you say, okay, this should be done? If you actually reach that point, which I think we all agree went way too far, obviously.
Yeah, if you reach that point.
But it happens, right? It happens.
It can happen, yeah. And often what you see in those cases is that the business decides, well, this is becoming too costly. We're going to have to set up a new platform.
Completely redevelop it, basically.
Exactly, and that's kind of the point where you actually reach your technical bankruptcy, because it's no longer feasible or worth it to work on your old or legacy system, or whatever you want to call it, existing system. So something new sounds better in that sense.
And that hypothetically would say, okay, but if I need to redevelop a complete new platform, I have a feature stop for, I don't know, a year. I have another cost unexpected because I've never told the business, the board, right? I have another $1 million to spend, for example.
Yeah.
And that could, as a result, you could say actually that the business can even go bankrupt as well. Because maybe my clients, they're like, there's already no features for a year, and I don't know. Okay, but that's the darker scenario. Let's say, okay, we take 10 steps back, right? How can we prevent this? How can we prevent this from a business point of view? How can we prevent this as a senior development team point of view? Because I can imagine when you have a very junior team, they might not dare to go to the business, we have a technical debt, or might not see it as quickly.
Yeah.
How would you, in the perfect scenario, how would you do with that? How to prevent this happening, right?
We already discussed the visibility of your technical debt.
Exactly. So that's a good first step.
Keeping track of it and adding it to your backlog. But that's not enough, because it can be on your backlog, and if you don't deal with it, then it's still
the famous saying, right? Oh, we'll put it on a backlog, right? And
exactly. Yeah. So one way would be to structurally make sure that you address your technical debt. So when you're planning your sprint, you make sure that a portion of that, and that can be, you can have a set rule for it, like 20%, 80%. So 20% dealing with technical debt and 80% new functionality or changes, for instance. It can also be a bit more flexible, but the key point is to keep working on it and make sure that you actually deal with it, and not periodically, but structurally.
But that requires discipline then as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you say 80-20 development cycles, or so-called sprints of, well, we usually have 2-week sprints. Basically, that says that, okay, 2 days out of the 10 need to focus on technical debt.
Yeah.
That indeed requires discipline, but if I do that consistently, basically then you're not building up, or you will build up technical debt.
At the very least, you reduce the impact that technical debt has on your system.
Yeah.
Because as we discussed earlier, you can't completely avoid it, because that's a fact of life. When you do things, when you do new things, you are going to have new insights. So it's inevitable that it happens, but if you can limit the impact of it, that is the best case scenario.
Yeah. Are there any other tips that you, if as a developer listening now, or someone from the business is listening or watching right now, is there any other tips that you would say?
Yeah, I think really the most important thing is to keep open communication about it.
Yeah.
So
that requires also a certain culture.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But it's I think the biggest risk is when you really treat the business and the technical side as two separate things.
Yeah.
Whereas actually it's all a team effort, and you're working together on this platform to, get the results you need.
Yeah.
So
open communication.
Yeah. I think that's one of the most important things. Discipline we already discussed.
Reporting, basically.
Yeah, right? Reporting, visibility. So if it's visible on your backlog, that really helps. And I think those are actually the two most important things.
And then in that way, if I do that consistently with enough discipline, open communication, transparency with the team, and that also requires indeed a certain culture, because you need to speak up to the business, for example, if it already goes a bit too far. Then that is the way to prevent technical debt, or not to prevent technical debt, but eventually even make sure you don't have any technical bankruptcy, or that it goes way too far.
Yeah, like we said before, like limiting the impact. And
consistently spending time on it. Yeah. A day a week, or 2 days a sprint, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on the phase. Maybe in some phases you need a bit more time to deal with it, especially early on when you just have your MVP phase finished. then it's really good to up that a little bit because you had a short time to market probably, so there is a large chance that you have incurred some technical debt. So if you then, right after your MVP phase, already have this cycle where you spend a bit more time to get rid of your technical debt as much as possible, that already helps a lot.
Yeah, and exactly, and right away, it's also a good way to teach someone or the team to spend enough time on it regularly.
Yeah, exactly, and I think it also, when it comes to the relationship with your client, it also becomes this almost ritual almost.
Exactly.
You just know what you're up against.
Yeah.
You know how to deal with it.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Edwin. You provide a lot of insights. Hopefully that will limit any technical bankruptcies in the future a little bit.
Let's hope so.
Cool, thanks.
You're welcome.